The last 24 hours in the conflict in Ukraine have taken what on the surface looks like an extremely ominous turn, with the most powerful warning to the West given by the Russians, specifically by President Putin himself, that has been made by any Russian official up to this time. Now, this warning was made in following a meeting which took place in Moscow. Putin addressed a cultural forum, and then, of course, at the end of that meeting, he left the forum itself, and he was asked a question by a journalist. Everything about the way in which the question was put to him, the wording of the question, and his answer suggest, at least to me, that this was all carefully prepared in advance, and that means that we should take Putin's warning especially seriously. I'm going to read out both the question and Putin's answer. They can be found on the Kremlin's website. The Kremlin rushed out a translation almost immediately, and this is what the Kremlin website reports the question and the answer to have been. And the question was this: over the past few days, we have been hearing statements at a very high level in Britain and the United States that the Kiev regime will be allowed to strike targets deep inside Russia using Western long-range weapons. Apparently, this decision is either about to be made or has already been made, as far as we can see. That is actually quite extraordinary. Could you comment on what is going on? And Putin replied as follows: what we are seeing is an attempt to substitute notions, because this is not a question of whether the Kiev regime is allowed or not allowed to strike targets on Russian territory. It is already carrying out strikes using unmanned aerial vehicles and other means. But using Western-made, long-range precision weapons is a completely different story. The fact is that, I have mentioned this, and any expert, both in our country and in the West, will confirm this, the Ukrainian army is not capable of using cutting-edge, high-precision, long-range systems supplied by the West. They cannot do that. These weapons are impossible to employ without intelligence data from satellites, which Ukraine does not have. This can only be done using the European Union satellites or US satellites, in general NATO satellites. That is the first point. The second point, perhaps the most important, the key point even, is that not only NATO military personnel can assign flights to these missile systems. The second point, perhaps the most important, the key point even, is that only NATO military personnel can assign flight missions to these missile systems. Ukraine servicemen cannot do this. Therefore, it is not a question of allowing the Ukrainian regime to strike Russia with these weapons or not. It is about deciding whether NATO countries become directly involved in the military conflict or not. If this decision is made, it will mean nothing short of direct involvement. It will mean that NATO countries, the United States and European countries are parties to the war in Ukraine. This will mean their direct involvement in the conflict, and it will clearly change the very essence, the very nature of the conflict dramatically. This will mean that NATO countries, the United States and European countries are at war with Russia. And if this is the case, then, bearing in mind the change in the essence of the conflict, we will make appropriate decisions in response to the threats that will be posed to us. So that was Putin's comments. Now, the key point that he is making, and he's made it before, as he rightly says, is this. It is contained in these words. The second point, perhaps the most important, the key point even, is that only NATO military personnel can assign flight missions to these missile systems. Ukrainian servicemen cannot do this. The point is this: the way these systems are constructed, the Storm Shadows, the Attackams, the JASSMs, the Scalps, all of these long-range missiles, the way they're designed and built means that in order to strike a particular target, they have to be programmed and operated by the personnel of the country that produces and supplies them. In the case of the Storm Shadow, it would be the British. In the case of weapon systems like the Attackams and the JASSMs, it would be the United States. So, if Storm Shadow missiles are launched by Ukraine against targets inside Russia, then that means that those Storm Shadow missiles have been programmed to attack those targets inside Russia by British military personnel, by British officers. And as Putin says, according to him at least, that must mean that the British would in that case be directly implicated in attacks on Russia, which is an act of war. And since it is an act of war, Britain and Russia would in effect be in a state of war. And if it was American missiles like the Attackams being launched, it would be the same. It would be American military personnel who would be operating and configuring them so that they would be made ready for the strike. And American military personnel would be directly involved in the missile strike. And that would be an act of war. And it would be an act of war by the United States against Russia. And Russia and the United States would accordingly be in a state of war with each other. Now, the fascinating thing about this section of Putin's warning, the section where he discusses the indispensable involvement of NATO military personnel in the event that these missile strikes were to take place. The fascinating thing about this part of Putin's warning is that in every single discussion of that warning, which I have seen, certainly in the British media, I'm guessing in the American media as well, that section in which the role of Western military personnel in any strikes, that section which he discusses the role of Western military personnel in any strikes is deleted. So that at least in Britain, people here are not being told about it by their own media. Now, I'm going to say straight away that I have discussed this question with various people who know about these things. And, well, you will see a discussion that Daniel Davis and I, Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis and I, had about Attackams missiles some time ago. As Putin correctly says, this isn't the first time he's made this point. He's made this point before, and he's just made it again. But after he made this point on a previous occasion, Daniel Davis and I talked about it in a program we did together on Daniel Davis Deep Dive. And Daniel Davis, Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis, who has much more familiarity with the Attackams missile than I do, essentially said that Putin was right. He said that it would not be possible for the Ukrainians to operate this kind of system by themselves. The United States would indeed be involved in configuring the missile to conduct the strike in exactly the way that Putin says. And I have no doubt at all that the same is true of the Storm Shadow and of the Scalp and of the JASSMs. And some months ago, we had a lengthy discussion between German military officers on the telephone, which someone was recording. The Russians provided us with a recording, and over the course of that discussion, in connection with the Taurus missile, the German officer said exactly the same thing, that in order for the Taurus missiles to be used in strikes against Russia or Russian facilities, such as, for example, the Crimean Bridge, the German technicians would have to configure the missile because it would not be possible because of the proprietary software for the Ukrainians to do it. So there we are. That's Putin's point. If you are involved in conducting strikes against another country, then you are committing an act of war against that country, and you are placing yourself in a position where you are in a state of war with that country. And in this case, Putin is saying it's NATO, or to be more specific, the Americans and the British, because it is they who are currently most active in discussing this question with each other. And if the Americans or the British take this step, then they are in effect in a state of war with Russia. And on the last point, Putin could not be more clear. If this decision is made, it will mean nothing short of direct involvement. It will mean that NATO countries, the United States and European countries are parties to the war in Ukraine. This will mean that NATO countries, the United States and European countries are at war with Russia. Those were his words. They're there, set out clearly on the Kremlin website. He's never spoken about this as clearly as he has this time. His language is completely unambiguous. Now, it is very important to understand that countries can be in a state of war without necessarily engaging in direct hostilities against each other. In fact, it happens more frequently than one might expect. I am, as most of you know, Greek, and for many, many decades, Greece and our neighbour, Albania, were in a state of war with each other. And I can remember the situation in the 60s and 70s in which the border, the Albanian and Greek border, was extremely tense, and there were all kinds of warnings given to people who operated small boats and yachts in the stretch of water between the Greek island of Corfu and the Albanian coast, not to get too close to the Albanian coast, because if one did, one was doing so very much at one's own risk. But despite Greece and Albania being in a state of war, there were no active hostilities. And Putin is not here talking about active hostilities, though of course he's not necessarily excluding that possibility. However, the Russians have taken another step within the last 24 hours, which I have absolutely no doubt is connected with this warning that Putin has given. And that is that the Russians have now expelled from Moscow 6 British diplomats from the embassy, the British embassy in Moscow, who they accuse of spying. Now, whether these diplomats were engaged in spying, I have absolutely no idea. most diplomats engage in some kind of information gathering, and any host government can call it spying if it chooses to. My own view is that the ability of British diplomats based in the embassy to do any genuine spying in Moscow now must be extremely constrained indeed. And I cannot believe that that is the reason why the Russians have expelled them. What I think the Russians are doing through this step is that they are underlining the warning that Putin has given. In fact, they're giving what I would say is a very strong hint that if a storm shadow attack on a facility inside pre-2014 Russia takes place, the Russians will consider themselves to be in a state of war with Britain, and that there will be immediate retaliation against the embassy, the British embassy in Moscow. By retaliation, I mean that the Russians could very well embark on steps leading to the complete rupture of diplomatic relations between Moscow and London. The closure of the British embassy in Moscow and the reciprocal closure of the Russian embassy in London. We would be in a situation where Britain and Russia no longer have diplomatic relations, a situation which existed for a brief period after the Russian Revolution, but which ended in the 1920s, early 1920s. We would be back to that situation again. And by the way, it would be a shock to the British if that were to happen, and I will discuss shortly why. So that, I think, is very likely a part of the Russian response if Storm Shadow missiles ever do strike Russian territory. Analogously, if the Americans start launching missiles against Russian territory, it's logical to assume that the Russians would do the same thing. Now, to say it very simply, if two countries are in a state of war with each other, it would be contradictory to that situation. It would be illogical, in fact, for those two countries to maintain diplomatic relations. So, a mutual closure of embassies, or rather, in this case, a decision where the Russians decide to close their embassy in London or perhaps Washington, and in return, and at the same time insist on the closure in Moscow of the British embassy and or the American embassy as well. Well, that would logically follow if the countries, Britain and Russia, the United States and Russia, were each to find themselves in the way that Putin says, in a state of war. But other things follow as well, because if two countries are in a state of war, then certain other things become possible. It becomes possible, for example, for a government that finds itself at war with another country to seize the assets in its own country, the assets that belong to the citizens and government of the other country, the country with which it is at war. And by the way, this can extend to diplomatic premises, or so I understand. The Russians could, for example, seize the very palatial residence of the British ambassador, which is located south of the Moscow River, opposite the Kremlin. many Russian officials have felt that it's well over time that this particular residence was returned to Russian ownership. And this has been a long-standing issue going back at least to the 1970s. So that's one thing. But of course, there's all sorts of commercial and business and other property that various various British companies and British individuals own in Russia as well, and the Russians would be at liberty to seize it. Now, I don't think this is legally controversial. As many of you may know, I am a devotee of classical music. I regularly attend a concert hall in London called the Wigmore Hall. The Wigmore Hall used to be called the Bechstein Hall before the First World War. It was built by the German Bechstein company, the people who make the pianos. And during the First World War, the British government seized it because Britain and Germany were at war with each other. And the British government then sold it on to third parties. And one way or the other, it ended up becoming the Wigmore Hall. The Bechstein company was never able to regain possession of it because its seizure by the British government was deemed completely lawful. So there we are. Now, the Russians would be, I think, quite happy to seize the assets of British companies and British individuals in Russia, and I believe that they are fairly substantial. They would be prepared, I suspect, if there was a state of war situation, to do the same with American assets, just saying. Relative to the size of the countries, I'm sure that the British assets are more significant for the British than the American assets are for the Americans, just saying. But anyway, the Russians could do that, and they could argue that since the countries are in a state of war, it would be entirely legal for them to do it. Now, by the way, and for the record, if we're talking about the frozen assets, the Russian frozen assets, which are located in Europe, well, for the moment, there is no legal avenue to seize those because European countries are not in a state of war with Russia. Just saying. So, there we are. That is another possibility that might follow. But of course, it is not the only one. The Russians have given warnings to the British. They gave a warning to the British ambassador some months ago when this idea of authorizing Ukrainian use of Storm Shadow missiles against Russia was first floated by the former British Foreign Secretary, Lord Cameron. Well, the Russians then warned that if such a thing happened, the Russians would consider themselves at liberty to undertake reciprocal strikes against British military assets anywhere in the world, including in Britain itself. Again, it was another warning that the Russians made, a warning given directly to the British ambassador in Moscow, who was called to the Russian Foreign Ministry for the purpose, with a detailed account of the discussion published on the Russian Foreign Ministry's website. Anyway, it is another one of those warnings that the Russians have given, which has not been properly publicized to the British public in the way that I think it should be. And the Russians have multiple options about how to do that. Obviously, if we're talking about Britain again, but of course what applies to Britain could equally apply to the United States. If we are talking about Britain, Britain is not a global superpower in the way that the United States is, but there are British military assets located in many places around the world. And of course, British Navy ships, such as they are, do patrol or attempt to patrol various places, locations, located in many cases very far away from British coasts. And any one of these assets, these bases, these warships, would from that moment on become potential Russian targets. And the important thing to say is that the initiative with respect to this would pass completely to the Russians. It would be up to them to decide when and if and in what way action against those British assets could take place. And of course, it's again something that the Russians have quite openly discussed doing. The Russians would be unlikely to do this themselves because, as I said previously, countries that are in a state of war are not necessarily in a state of armed conflict with each other, and I don't think the Russians want to be in a state of armed conflict with Britain. But if two countries are in a state of war, it is entirely open to the Russians to supply the weapons to Britain's enemies, of which there are many, by the way, around the world, and have those enemies do the work for the Russians and to do it by proxy. Now, the United States is very conscious of this. There's been an article today in the New York Times which straightforwardly confirms that the Pentagon is worried that if permission is given or if a decision is made to allow or to undertake deep strikes inside Russia with American missiles, then the Russians will start to supply advanced systems to American adversaries in the Middle East, putting the position of the United States and of US forces in the Middle East in jeopardy. And this is confirmed today as a genuine concern within the Pentagon by the New York Times. So, there we are. We have Putin's warning. It is very stark. We have begun to see the shape of the initial Russian reaction with the expulsion of the journalists. We have also been given a hint that it might extend further beyond that with an ending of diplomatic relations. And the Russians have already spoken of their willingness to provide advanced weapons to third parties that are antagonistic to the United States and to Britain, and to see them use these weapons in a way that would constitute retaliation against Britain and the United States were these disastrous steps ever to be taken. Well, why then, given the strength of the Russian reaction, are the British and the Americans even debating doing something like this? Let me just, before I discuss that, make a few further points. The potential for the Russians facilitating strikes against US and British, perhaps let's focus today on Britain, on British assets, military assets around the world, is very real, and it could prove disastrous. By the way, the state of the British armed forces is lamentable by every account. There are relatively few operational tanks. There are problems with the Royal Air Force. I read somewhere some time ago that only 100, in other words, half of the fighter jets are available for use. There are massive budgetary problems. The Royal Navy is said to be in relatively poor shape. The Queen Elizabeth class aircraft carriers don't have fighter jet complements because that hasn't been afforded. Why are the British taking on the Russians, who are a military superpower, in this way, when their own military position is so fragile? But if we're talking about Britain and the United States, a ending of diplomatic relations would be, frankly, something of a disaster. Russia is a superpower, military superpower. That has been disputed by many people. It's becoming more difficult to deny with every week that the Ukraine war continues. It is a center of international diplomacy. In Moscow, over the last 24 hours, Putin has had meetings with Wang Yi, the foreign minister of China. He's met with the national security advisors of Iran and India. Lavrov regularly hosts foreign visitors. Every day, it seems, Putin speaks to a foreign leader somewhere. There's a whole procession of leaders from all around the world that visit Moscow, and they have to do so because Russia is such a critically important country. It is a military industrial powerhouse, as we have seen, and it is absolutely critically important to world trade. It provides oil and gas and raw materials and food, without which the situation of the global economy would be very bad indeed. So a country, let's say Britain again, that isn't able to talk to this very important and very powerful country is at a serious disadvantage in international diplomacy. The British would, in effect, be talking mostly to themselves and to their own allies. Now, that might seem an inconvenience, but how are political leaders in the global south, in South Africa, in India, in China, wherever, going to take British diplomacy seriously if the British are unable to maintain communications, dialogue with one of the world's major powers? It would be a huge blow. And of course, a lot of diplomatic relations, of diplomatic contacts, would over time probably also be a major blow for the British economy. I can remember vividly how just a few years ago, BP, the British oil company, saw Russia as the place where it would secure for itself the oil that it needed in order to preserve its position as one of the major oil companies. And it's only a relatively short time since the City of London, the financial centre, the legal community that has been created around it, the London housing market, which depends on it, were all soliciting Russian business and Russian investment, and this played undoubtedly a significant role in maintaining Britain as an important trading power. And of course, the British were also involved in brokering many of the deals on mineral extraction and supply around the world. They provided insurance to Russian ships. They did all sorts of things of that kind. And if they're permanently cut off from that, given Russia's importance in the global trading system, then that will over time be a cumulative blow. For the United States not being able to talk to the adversary superpower, the one that has the ability to destroy the United States over the course of a single day, the most powerful nuclear power on the planet, the country whose every military move the United States is obliged to track, well, that would be such a disaster for the United States that I suspect that urgent steps are going to be taken over the next few hours and days to prevent that happening. And we're starting to see what some of those steps are. So the rupture of diplomatic relations, if it comes, is very far from being an insignificant or unimportant step. On the contrary, it would be a massively consequential one. We would have the usual brave words in the immediate aftermath. All sorts of people would say that the Russians have shot themselves in the foot or done something of that kind. And certainly it's not something that they will do lightly or would perhaps ideally want to do. But at this time, when they are so heavily sanctioned, the effect on them is probably mitigated, whereas on Britain and the United States, were it to happen, it would be cumulatively devastating. And that's not even taking into account, as I said, the possible military responses if Russia starts to supply advanced missile technology to various Western enemies and adversaries around the world. So we come back to this question, why do this? First of all, it's now become increasingly clear that this is not going to achieve anything in military terms. It is not going to change the situation on the battlefields in Ukraine. The Russians, by the way, have been saying as much. Yesterday, Group of Forces North addressed this very issue. They said this on their website. I read the exact words. There is much talk about permission from the West to strike Russia with NATO long-range weapons. In this regard, it can be said that our own air defense crews have been successfully repelling enemy missile attacks using foreign multiple launch rocket systems for a long time. The Ukrainian armed forces have long been using the entire range of weapons transferred by the West in the Kursk region. Formal permissions, and the Group of Forces North website puts the word permissions in inverted commas, and speculation in the media on this matter are intended to cause panic within the country. The Russian army will see this through to the end and does not need to ask anyone for permission. That's said by the Russian army itself, because of course Group of Forces North is a part of it. And, well, others have been saying it too. In Russia, Apti Alaudinov, the Chechen officer, has also been talking about this. He says it's clear that these are methods of psychological warfare against our people. They can easily give this permission, and I'm more than sure, that they will give this permission. But the question is, how many of these missiles are they going to transfer to Ukraine? What can be done with this number of missiles? What can be changed directly on the front? Absolutely nothing. For us, nothing will change directly on the front because the front is moving and will continue to move until we win. That's what Alaudinov said in an interview yesterday with Russia 1 television station. And what Group of Forces North are saying and what Alaudinov is saying is being confirmed by the Pentagon and by all sorts of commentaries that are appearing all over the British and American media. Briefly, all of these comments say the same thing. They've been said by Lloyd Austin. They've been said by the Pentagon spokesman, Patrick Ryder. They've appeared in various articles in The Guardian, in The Telegraph, in all sorts of other places. The number of ATACMS missiles left in Ukraine's stockpile is now very small because so many of them have been expended on strikes against Crimea. Strikes, by the way, which have achieved little. The number of storm shadows in Ukraine's stockpile is also very limited because, again, the Ukrainians have used the greatest majority of those storm shadows in strikes against Crimea, which have also achieved very little. On the subject of storm shadows, we're told that the British stockpile is now very small. The British media has already confirmed the production of the storm shadows in Britain has effectively stopped and has been stopped for some time. Some production of the similar Scalp missile continues in France, but only at a very low rate of production, which can only be increased with some difficulty. If we are talking about the ATACMS, well, the American stockpile is obviously bigger, but the American need for these sort of missiles is much greater. And here again, a significant part of the stockpile has already been transferred to Ukraine. The United States, the military, the Pentagon, have basically said they don't want to transfer any more because the Pentagon doesn't want to see the stockpile reduced any further, and that production of ATACMS is apparently slow and complicated and very low rate. In my opinion, the reality is that there is no such production going on at all and hasn't been going on since at least 2006. Just saying. So, relatively few missiles. What can they do if used against Russia? Again, the Pentagon are telling us that the Russians have relocated all their fighter jets, with all their missiles and weapons, 90% of them outside the range of the ATACMS and the Storm Shadows. What exactly would the Ukrainians be striking at? Well, they can strike at all kinds of civilian facilities, but as we will see in a moment, the latest word is that the British and the Americans are so nervous about this whole idea that they're going to tighten control on use of these weapon systems. They're only going to allow strikes, or let's to be clear about this, they're only going to engage in these strikes on the basis of a clear operational plan and in circumstances where the strike can actually achieve something tangible in a military sense. That's the story that we're hearing in the British media now. But Patrick Ryder, Lloyd Austin, others, they're all telling us the same thing, that there's no wonder weapon or silver bullet in this war, no weapon that can change the direction of the war. So why risk getting yourself into what Putin says will be a state of war with Russia, one with all the terrible consequences that we have seen, if it is not going to achieve anything significant or important or effective on the battlefronts? Now, even if the number of Storm Shadows and ATACMS, which could be supplied to Ukraine, and JASSMs as well, were much greater than it apparently is, to repeat again, Russia is the biggest country in the world. The major positions that would need to be defended in Russia, the Russians have the most advanced air defense system in the world. They would take steps to defend them. And given the size of the country, given the size of Russia's military-industrial complex, given the size of Russia's armed forces, it beggars belief that strikes by even a couple of hundred missiles are going to be able to change the entire course of a war in Ukraine, which is already being lost. If, as is much more likely, The actual number of missiles that can be used in these strikes is no more than a couple of dozen. Well, the whole thing becomes an exercise in pointlessness and futility. Well, why do it? Why, in that case, do something that, on the face of it, is so counterproductive? Something which, by the way, is going to play directly into the hands of the most hardline figures within the Kremlin, within the Russian government. Well, it seems that Medvedev, who is the unofficial spokesman now of the hardliners, he's now coming out and saying that if long-range missiles are used by the Ukrainians and the Western powers in this way, well, then the only correct and right thing for Russia to do is to advance all the way to the point where it would be impossible to launch missiles that could threaten Russian cities. And where the point, he says, where that is, that point beyond which the missiles cease to be a threat, well, unsurprisingly, he places it on Ukraine's Polish border. Now, over the course of a live stream that we did a couple of days ago, Alex Christoforou and I, a commentator, a member of the Duran community, made an extremely shrewd point, which is that if the Russians advance westwards and occupy and annex Kiev and annex Ukrainian territory, that will be an unacceptable act for some of the BRICS states. The Brazilians and the Indians would be deeply opposed to it. And if Russia were to take a step like that, there would be a real risk of BRICS disintegration. And I think that is correct, by the way, and it is an important constraint on Russian actions. However, if you start launching long-range missiles from Ukrainian territory against Russia, against Russian facilities, inside what all the world, including Ukraine and the West, accept is Russia, well, the Russians suddenly can turn round to the Brazilians and to the Indians and say, well, look, this is what is being done to us. These countries are consistently aggressive against us. They clearly represent a massive threat to us. They are launching attacks against what even you recognize is our national territory. That shows that we were right all along about Ukraine, and it also shows that the only effective way out, given this compulsive hostility of the Western powers towards us, is to push westwards, perhaps all of the way to the Polish border, in order to keep these missiles out of range. And I can see how that kind of argument might carry weight, especially in Delhi, but perhaps in Brasilia as well. So, come back to all of this. Why do this? Why do something that makes absolutely no sense? No sense from a military point of view. It can only put the West in a much weaker position going forward, and it can only ultimately further harm Ukraine's prospects. Well, I have to say that I don't fully understand the answer myself. It seems to me that what appears to have happened is that a couple of weeks ago, when this idea was first floated, the United States put its foot down and said no. And then we had a change of government in London, and the new British government wanted to reaffirm in the most public way that it could its hostility to Russia, its support for the project Ukraine, its determination to establish itself and to impress the British commentariat and political class with the strength of its resolve against the Russian enemy. Anyway, we had a new British government, one which recklessly invited Zelensky to attend a cabinet meeting in London, and which has then gone all out and come up with this plan. And inevitably, they found some resonance amongst all the usual people in Washington. I'm not going to discuss in this program the interview that Victoria Nuland has recently given, in which she all but admits the role of the Western powers in wrecking the Istanbul Agreement, and all of the various other things that she says about the conflict in Ukraine and about the conduct of US foreign policy altogether. What I would say is that if you want to see somebody who is completely unabashed about her neocon views, you should go and listen to that interview. And moreover, it's absolutely clear that in Victoria Nuland's case, that thing that I always say, that neocons have no reverse gear and no ability to think back and reflect on the consequences of what they have done, well, it all applies in spades. And of course, the neocons in Washington, like, by the way, the neocons in Brussels and the neocons in Paris and elsewhere, and of course in London, well, what they all see is that Project Ukraine, their beloved Project Ukraine, is now falling apart all around them. And for that reason, they are now looking for some way again to turn it round, and they do it in the way that they have always done, by pressing constantly for more and more escalation. So when the British came along after the new government took office in July and said, well, let's go ahead and conduct these deep missile strikes in Russia, well, the Ukrainians, of course, seized on it. Zelensky and his officials have always been keen on this idea because they're looking for any possible way that they can to try to involve NATO and the United States directly in the war. Given that they're now obviously losing the war, this has become a major priority for them. Well, the Ukrainians jumped on what the British were doing and spoke about it and amplified it, and the British badgered the Americans about this. And of course, in the State Department, which is apparently filled with neocons, and in the person of Tony Blinken, they found a receptive ear. And it looks as if they also found a receptive ear in the person of the occupant of the Oval Office, who has never, at any point in this conflict, seen a red line. Most of even red lines which he himself has drawn. Anyway, he has never seen a red line which he didn't at some point decide to cross. And if the reports that we're getting in the British media are true, and they've been taken up and amplified by the Russian media as well, well, the occupant of the White House some time ago, perhaps a week ago, took a decision allowing missile strikes or agreeing to missile strikes deep inside Russia, except that it hasn't so far been made public. And all of the reports we were getting until a few days ago spoke about how Blinken and Lammy, the British Foreign Secretary, would be going to Kiev and would be announcing that decision there. Except, of course, that the Russians are now reacting in the way that I've discussed in this program. The Pentagon has made known its deep unhappiness about a project which makes no military or strategic sense. Many of the European allies, especially the Germans, are said to be very unhappy, and there's pushback. And this is why we're now starting to get all kinds of contradictory and muddled signals. The decision to authorize or to conduct the deep missile strikes in principle has already been made. It's difficult to reverse when that decision has been made and signed off by the President of the United States himself, even if it hasn't been publicly announced. But you have all of these problems which perhaps you didn't think through properly before. So, Blinken meets the Europeans about a week ago. They tell him, we don't agree, or at least enough of them tell him that we don't agree, so that it is not a NATO plan. And the Pentagon then makes clear that they don't agree either, that they're deeply unhappy about this, and that they do not want the United States directly involved and exposed. And the latest story that we're hearing, even as Keir Starmer, British Prime Minister Keir Starmer, arrives in Washington preparing to meet the President, the latest story is that there's not going to be any kind of public announcement at all. There wasn't an announcement in Kiev by Blinken and Lamy. There won't be an announcement when Biden and Starmer meet in Washington. There's not going to be a press conference. Biden and Starmer are not going to hold a joint press conference. Of course, President Biden doesn't generally hold press conferences anymore for entirely different reasons, but apparently there's not going to be a press conference. There will be no announcement at all. And the story that's been put out, and it was put out yesterday in The Guardian, and you can still find the article floating around somewhere in The Guardian today, is that there's not actually going to be an announcement. The decision has been made, but it cannot be reversed, But instead, the Ukrainians have been told that only the British will conduct the strikes, only the Storm Shadows can be used, in other words, to conduct the strikes. The British obviously will facilitate in whatever way they can. The Americans will not be directly involved. ATACMS missiles will not be used. JASSM's missiles will not be used. Only Storm Shadows will be used. And they will only be used if a specific target, a high-value target, is identified and the attack on that target would somehow facilitate military operations. And only once the attack has been made, and only if the nature of the attack cannot be concealed, will the Americans and the British acknowledge publicly that it has been done. Now, on the face of it, it's impossible to see how the conditions that The Guardian is talking about could ever be met. Because, as I've said previously, there is no target inside Russia that is so high value that attacking it would really change the military picture anywhere on any part of the battlefronts. On the face of it, this is an attempt to throw back the whole question to the Ukrainians and put the onus on the Ukrainians to come up with a target, and then when the Ukrainians are unable to come up with the target, to let the whole idea of missile strikes against Russia quietly fade away. Well, it's not impossible that that might happen. As a grizzled veteran of governments, of seeing how governments can work, I've seen this sort of thing happen myself many times. that you make a decision in principle, you can't reverse the decision, so you hedge around the decision with so many conditions that it can't actually ever be implemented or put into action. It's a typical bureaucratic ploy. But we're dealing with the neocons, we're dealing with the Ukrainians, we're dealing with people in London who are desperate to cut a figure. So at some point, I think that some target somewhere is going to be found. A missile will be launched against it. It might hit, it might not. If it hits, it will only do a limited amount of damage. We've seen storm shadows used many times over the course of the war. They've not achieved, as I said, very much. There's no reason to think they will achieve very much if used deep inside Russia. They can't actually travel very deep inside Russia, certainly not without exposing the carrier aircraft, which would have to fly close to the Russian border. And besides, even then, even if they could be launched from that distance, they only have a range of around 300 kilometers. But anyway, I suspect something like this will eventually be done, and it's entirely plausible that we will then, at that point, start to see all of the Russian retaliatory steps which I outlined earlier in this program. That is my expectation. Anyway, but the very fact that as of the time of making of this program, and of course one has to qualify everything because it does seem there's always a possibility with these kind of decisions that the president himself will insist on a public announcement, or Secretary Blinken will insist on a public announcement. Anyway, whatever, the fact that it's all being done in this hole in the corner way tells us how botched, unsatisfactory, ill-conceived, poorly thought through, and counterproductive this whole episode, this whole concept has been. It's an exceptionally bad idea. It's a bad idea that, like so many others, throughout this entire conflict, people cannot allow to die, and it's likely that it will be put into effect, even though by now I suspect pretty much everybody, except a few hardline neocons, people like perhaps Tony Blinken and David Lammy, and our old friend Colonel Hamish de Bretton Gordon, writing on this topic in the Daily Telegraph today. Everybody, apart from them, now realizes what an extraordinarily bad idea it is. Now, there we are. One person who I sense is furious about the way everything is going is none other than President Zelensky himself. Over the last 24 hours, he has been raging in the most astonishing way. First of all, he made incredible claims about how the Russian counteroffensive in the Kursk region is following exactly the Ukrainian plan. Group of Forces North, by the way, has its own point to make about this. It's incredibly sardonic, as one might expect. But anyway, they've responded to Zelensky's comments about how this is all part of Zelensky's great master plan, how the Russian counterattack in Kursk is part of the great master plan. And they put it like this. As expected, this is from their website, Group of Forces North's website. As expected, after the loss of captured territories in the Korenovo and other border areas of Kursk region, the enemy is increasing its efforts to break through the border in other areas. According to the leader of the Kiev regime, that's to say Zelensky, this is part of a certain Ukrainian plan. If his goal is to litter the fields and forests of the Kursk border with the corpses of Ukrainian soldiers, then this plan is really being carried out perfectly. Only one question arises: who is the initiator of such planning? The Ukrainian government or their Western masters? Anyway, that's Group of Forces North's comment about Zelensky's claim that this is all part of his great and cunning and brilliant master plan. Apart from that, Zelensky has also made comments about China and Brazil that were so abusive that they were frankly extraordinary. He talked about at length a Chinese-Brazilian joint statement, which was published as far back as last May. I have absolutely no understanding of what relevance that has to the situation that we see today. But anyway, he came out, he spoke about how this joint statement was completely destructive, how China and Brazil have in effect sided against against Ukraine and with the Russians, how this is basically a war between right and wrong, good and evil. Ukraine is right and good, Russia is wrong and evil, and that the Chinese and the Brazilians, by purporting to maintain some kind of equidistance between the two countries, well, just goes to prove that they've sided with wrong and evil instead of right and good. He didn't quite put it like that, but the words he used essentially said it in exactly the way, well, in the way that I have said it. The Chinese must be absolutely beside themselves with anger after listening to words like this. The Brazilians, who've been working very hard to try to get some kind of peace conference set up, which the Ukrainians and the Russians both attend, and trying to help the Ukrainians out of their predicament in that way. Well, some of them must be asking, why do they bother? Anyway, there we go. Zelensky is absolutely furious. Obviously, a lot is going wrong on the battlefronts. We'll come to that in a moment, and that probably explains one reason for his anger. He must be sensing that everything is falling apart. But I get the further sense that what makes him particularly angry is the muddled and confused message he received from Blinken and Lamy when they arrived in Kiev. He was probably expecting a straightforward statement of support and a promise and a public statement that the Western powers agreed to the Ukrainian demand for strikes deep inside Russia. What he got was this muddled proposal that yes, the occasional strike might be carried out with storm shadows, but it would all have to be checked and calibrated and thought through in each and every case meticulously in advance. And my sense is that must have completely infuriated him. He's always, it seemed to me, been somebody who works very much on the edge, and on this occasion, he fell off the edge. The fact that there's been no confirmation so far that he will indeed be meeting with Biden this month. He's spoken repeatedly about a summit meeting with Biden as if it was a done and agreed thing. And apparently it is not, at least not as of the time of the making of this program. Well, that might have annoyed him even further. But anyway, Zelensky is furious, he's raging, he's taking out his anger against the Chinese and the Brazilians. And he's coming up with bizarre comments about how Operation Kursk is proceeding exactly according to plan, his plan, even as it all starts to fall apart. I suspect, as I said, that the thing that really annoyed him was the botched and muddled and confusing message he got from Blinken and Lamy when they came with Zelensky in tow to Kiev. Anyway, let's actually now finish this program by looking at what is happening on the battlefronts, because things are moving fast. There's been a lot of misleading narrative about how things slow down over the last couple of days. In a sense, that's true in terms of territory captured, because the Russians have now reached, as I said, Mercouris and it's the towns around it. So the advance there has, in terms of distance travelled, slowed. But in actual terms of what is happening, there's been no slowdown, as far as I can see, at all. Anyway, we've had a cascade of reports over the last couple of hours. The first set of reports relates to the ongoing situation in Kursk. And without going through all the details of what the group of forces north and the Russian Defense Ministry are telling us, it looks as if some of the claims some Russian bloggers were making yesterday, that the important village of Lyubimovka had been captured as of yesterday, were wrong. However, today the Russian Defense Ministry says that two villages, Tolstoy Lug and Pokrovsky, both to the south of Lyubimovka. Tolstoy Lug is actually to the southeast of Lyubimovka, and it should be said that the Russians in this area are advancing from a north and westward direction. So they're pushing from the west to the east, not from the east to the west. Anyway, it looks as if the Russians are saying that they've captured these two villages, which must mean that the Russians are also present in Lyubimovka, and apparently there is confirmation of this, and there is clearly a fight going on for control of that village. And to say it quickly, I think Lyubimovka will fall under Russian control probably over the course of today, and we'll probably have confirmation of this from the Russian Defense Ministry tomorrow. And Obukhova, the other village that was talked about yesterday, well, that does indeed seem to be under Russian control. And reportedly, the Russians have captured another village, Darino, which is located to the southwest, closer to the Ukrainian border, and perhaps another village in this general area as well, called Nikolaevo Darino as well. Now, that appears to be the limit of the Russian offensive so far on the western flank of the enclave that the Ukrainians have in Kursk region. Elsewhere, however, we are also getting reports of Russian advances. The Russians have advanced further, apparently, in the Malaya Lochnia area. Putin, incidentally, had a meeting, a one-to-one meeting with the commander of a Russian unit which at one time defended itself in Malaya Lochnia and which was temporarily besieged there. That siege took place several weeks ago at the start of Ukraine's Kursk offensive. It looks as if all of the reports about Malaya Lochnia having been captured by the Ukrainians were wrong. Anyway, the Russians have been pushing forward in that area, and there are also reports that they have now pushed the Ukrainians back further towards Sudzha from the village of Ruskaya Konopelka, which is located to the east of Sudzha, and which, by the way, is located quite close to Sudzha. If all of this is correct, if the Russians control or end up controlling all of these villages, then, as I have said in my program yesterday, the Ukrainian enclave is reduced to a relatively small and poorly inhabited stretch of territory located immediately around Sudzha itself. In fact, apart from Sudzha, there would just be a few villages, Gogolyevka, Kazachya, Lochnia, Lebedyevka, Sverdlivkovo, which would still be under Ukrainian control. And this might not be the last offensive that the Russians have in mind for the Kursk region. But anyway, we can see that the situation is extremely bad. Now, the Russians have been talking, and many commentators have been talking about an attempted Ukrainian counterattack across the Ukrainian border towards the village of Glushkova. This is the area south of the Naim River, about which there was an awful lot of talk a couple of weeks ago. Glushkovo, there's other places, Sukhinovka and Veseloye. The Russians now are clearly saying, including Group of Forces North, are now clearly saying that all of those attacks for the moment have been repelled. And from what I can see so far, the Ukrainian counterattacks in this area are rather underpowered. But anyway, it's doubtless the next move that the Ukrainians are going to try and make. Maybe they will recommit to it. I don't think this is going to cause the Russians any disarray. I think they will have anticipated this Ukrainian move. So I don't think that the situation is the situation around Glushkovo is going to concern the Russians very much. Now let's turn to the other places on the battlefronts. And yesterday I said that there were reports that Ukrainsk had been abandoned by the Ukrainians, that the Ukrainians had pulled out of Ukrainsk. And last night there were reports that the Russians do indeed control all of the residential area of Ukrainsk, that they still have to capture the coal mine and the slag heap immediately to the north of Ukrainsk. So it looks as if the battle for Ukrainsk is all but ended. At least that's what the reports say. There's still, however, a lot to do, or so it seems, and the Russians have to continue to advance to the south, to Girnik or Gornak, call it what you will. And there's also the unresolved battle of Selidovo to complete. But perhaps the more dramatic news is about what has been happening elsewhere, which is that further south, which is that we now have confirmation that a Russian force has advanced from Krasnogorovka, the town that the Russians have now completed the capture of, and has occupied the village of Gostre, which is apparently undefended. Gostre is located a short distance east of Kurakovo. I'm going to guess that Kurakovo is well within artillery range of the Russian troops in Gostre, and there doesn't seem to be any other position between Gostre and Kurakovo where the Ukrainians can establish defenses. And it looks as if the Russians are now preparing a major attack on Kurakovo. They're located to the east of Kurakovo in Gostre. They've been pushing towards Kurakovo through the village of Maximilianovka, and apparently they've been making significant advances there. And they've also, it seems, now largely occupied the fields north of Krasnogorovka, the fields where the Ukrainian forces were said to be trapped. I get the sense that the Ukrainians completely abandoned their positions in these fields some days ago, probably some weeks ago now, and that the Russians have completely abandoned their positions there, which will mean that the Russians now have a continuous front line from their forward positions in Gostre, west of Krasnogorovka, in Maximilianovka, extending northward all the way to Galitsinivka and Karlovka, which have been captured by the Russian forces that have been advancing on this territory from the east group of forces center, led by their General Mordvichev, the troops that have just captured Ukrainsk and which are likely to capture Girnik and Tsukurinye very soon. And all of this is happening at one and the same time as the Russians have also resumed, or perhaps they've always continued, their advances around Vuhledar. There's now pictures of the Russians pushing from Vuhledar towards the village of Bogoyavlenka, and as has been discussed by many people, if Bogoyavlenka is captured by the Russians, then Vuhledar is completely surrounded. It is in effect in a cauldron, and I wonder whether the Ukrainians, before that happens, are going to pull their troops out of Vuhledar as well, rather than try and defend it, hopeless as the defense of Vuhledar would appear to be. To repeat again, the entire force that the Ukrainians have in southern Donbass is edging towards total collapse. The capture by the Russians over the last couple of hours of Ukrainsk and Gostre brings that process closer. If the Russians soon capture Bogoyavlenka, then the situation will become critical indeed, and capture Girnik as well. And also, if the Russians are able to capture all of these places, then the increasingly isolated garrison that the Ukrainians have rushed to Selidovo, which is apparently, by the way, also retreating in Selidovo itself, its position will become impossible also. And in the meantime, the Russians are busy bombing and shelling Pokrovsk and inflicting massive damage on the Ukrainians there. Now, elsewhere on the battlefronts, there's been less news from Siversk and from Chasiv Yar, but we've now had clarity about the situation in Toretsk. This is the area where, in New York to be specific, where the Ukrainians supposedly conducted the successful counteroffensive in the area of the phenol plant, the industrial plant in New York, where they linked up with their forces that were defending the phenol plant. This is the 12th Azov Brigade. I don't know what the full truth of that story is, but the latest pictures apparently now conclusively confirm that the Russians are in control of the industrial area of New York, including the phenol plant. So any question about what's going on in New York has been resolved, and predictably it's been resolved in the Russians' favor. And the Russians continue their advance within Toretsk itself. They've now reached, apparently, the central area of Toretsk. There's an area of high-rise buildings there. There are lots of coal mines and slag heaps located, dotted around this whole area of Toretsk. Some of these are potentially strong fortified positions. But step by step, in fact not so slowly, stride by stride, the Russians continue their advance on Toretsk. It is because of the escalating catastrophe on the battlefronts, with the Ukrainian army, short of men and machines, suffering terrible losses, and with its command systems starting to break down. It is because of this situation that we've had this flurry of talk and activity over the last couple of days about the use of long-range missiles to try to change the situation in Ukraine. As I have said before, it won't save Ukraine. It will only make the situation there worse. It's a disastrous act of folly. It shows again, by the way, how unwilling certain people are in Kiev, in London, in Washington, to face reality and to face the prospect of good faith negotiations, something that has never happened at any point over the course of this conflict ever since the Maidan crisis of 2014. Just saying. They come up instead with these dangerous, reckless, fantastic plans. And in the case of the long-range missile strikes, my sense is it's already blowing up in their face. Anyway, this is where I finish today's program. More from me soon. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar and by going to our shop. Links under this video. And last but not least, if you've liked this program, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.